The DOJ dropped a Sherman Act suit on Apple today, right as we were about to tape the program. It seems like Thursdays is the big news drop day now. So this DOJ suit outlines 5 alleged abuses, and they claim, obviously, that those abuses reduce competition while limiting consumer choice and raising the prices that consumers pay for their iPhone. We talked about this actually just a couple of weeks ago when we talked about peak Apple. The 5 categories are, very quickly, super apps, cloud gaming apps, messaging apps, smartwatches, and digital wallets. If you don't know about super apps, that's the one that's maybe you haven't heard of if you're listening to this. In Asia, they mentioned how Alipay, WeChat, and Paytm are super apps. What does that mean? You get like 5 or 6 different functions in one app: social media, images, purchasing, getting rides, all that stuff. And when you have that, you can move from one platform to another super easily. And when it comes to messaging apps, we've all experienced the green bubble friend. So the main argument of the lawsuit, pretty interesting. They explain, and it's a really well-written document, I read it this morning, that when Apple faces new competition, instead of lowering prices for consumers or offering a better deal to developers, they would, quote, meet competitive threats by imposing a series of shape-shifting rules and restrictions in its App Store guidelines and developer agreements. I've faced this every time I've invested in an app startup. They complain about the goalpost moving by Apple, and Apple shares down about 3% on the news today. I'm sure everybody's got some interesting thoughts on it. Chamath, you were talking about peak Apple just last week or the week before, I think. What are your thoughts on the lawsuit that dropped today?
To be honest, I haven't read it, and I don't really know the odds of these things, just because it seems like some of this stuff is so clearly political. And I think that these things have seasons to it, in the sense that there are moments where these things are more likely to go in the favor of the company and more likely to go in favor of the government. The one thing I'll say is that these guys have been losing a fair number of these things. So they're kind of 50-50 in their fight with Epic. They've basically lost against their fight with Spotify. They definitely are in a moment where people are looking at the profitability of these devices as the source of their long-term cash flow. And I think they realize that there's not a lot of growth because they haven't entered a bunch of new markets. So the real question is, knowing all of that, did they do something beyond what they've already always done to try to lock people in? And can they prove it? I think that that's really where the government's case will come down to, because then it's clear that Apple probably understood that their market was kind of solidifying, and they introduced these blocks essentially into processes that force people to stay. That's probably bad news for them, but I don't really know because I haven't read the lawsuit.
Yeah. Sax, did you get a chance to read it, or do you have any thoughts, generally speaking?
I haven't read the filings, but I read some of the press coverage about it. I would say, based on the press coverage that I read, that there's not really a smoking gun here. At least the press hasn't reported one. And what I mean by that is, let me give you a couple of examples that were in the press. One is that apparently the filing made a point about when Tim Cook was confronted some time ago by a user saying, when I try to send a video by text to someone with an Android phone, it just doesn't work very well. It never works. It was a guy trying to send a video to his mom. And Tim Cook responded, well, your mom should buy an iPhone. It's kind of like a throwaway comment by Tim Cook. Probably not a great idea for him to say that, but that's an example of what the lawsuit brings up. Another example is that the Apple Watch doesn't work with Android phones. It only works with iPhones, obviously. Again, is that really a smoking gun issue? I don't think so. I mean, this is Apple's whole strategy, is that all of its products work seamlessly together, and Apple hardware doesn't really work with other operating systems. It never has. So, at least based on the press coverage, I've yet to see a single smoking gun example coming out of this lawsuit. Now, I think what those examples highlight is what this lawsuit is really about is your view of interoperability. What the government is saying is that Apple needs to make its apps and its devices more interoperable with other ecosystems. So the watch needs to be interoperable with Android. Apple messaging needs to be interoperable with Android messaging, and so on. What the government is saying is that Apple is refusing to play ball with other applications, other operating systems, and that creates a monopolistic network effect. What I think Apple would say is no. The fact is that Apple, from the outset, has always tried to do everything soup to nuts. We've always done the hardware and the software together. And that's what creates the magical experience. And so Apple's entire product strategy is based on creating a vertically integrated stack that goes from hardware to operating system to key applications. And I think Apple has a point saying, if you try to make us unwind all of that, the product's just not going to work as well. It's not going to be the same product experience that everyone's used to. So again, I think that how you view interoperability is at the core of this lawsuit. I think that both the government and Apple make good points about that. And I'm a little bit skeptical right now that the government has a smoking gun. At least one hasn't been reported in the press. And so I'm a little bit doubtful right now that the government's going to be able to win this case.
Freeberg, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a function of consumer choice. If consumers want to have this closed system where they can iMessage with other iMessage app holders and not be able to have a seamless integrated messaging experience with Android users, they'll be happy. If they're annoyed, they'll switch over to an Android. So, this has always been Apple's orientation. I think I mentioned this to you guys. I've been on a Mac since 1984 when the Mac Original came out. I still have my first Mac Original, by the way. I keep it in my office on my shelf. And Apple's, always had like a really hard focus on the software that they make available to their users to create an incredible product experience. So I don't know if this is necessarily about market abuse as much as it is a consumer choice. If the consumers didn't like the product, they didn't like the fact that things were not available, that things were very expensive, they would go elsewhere. And you do see that in segments of the market. And as we talked about a few weeks ago, you do see that ex-US. Most of the smartphone market is actually Android driven.
Yeah.
So this is a premium product that people are willing to pay a premium price for, even if that means limited access. I think developers are frustrated that they can't access this premium market, but I'm not sure that Apple necessarily should be coerced to service developers when at the end of the day, the consumers are paying for the products.
And to your point, like, is it really the case that a green bubble versus a blue bubble is really that limiting? It's not the end of the world.
It's annoying, but not super
it's not
limiting.
the end of the world.
Yeah, I would say Apple has completely abused their power every chance they get in order to capture this 30% from the App Store. They blocked the ability for you to use Audible or, other marketplaces to buy books and media. They blocked the ability to use other media players like VLC. They blocked the ability to use browsers. And if you leave Apple unchecked, they just keep abusing it. And so I think this is kind of one of those lawsuits that's like, if we don't stop them, they'll just keep making it worse. And when people file complaints, then Apple will back down, which they did on media players, and they'll stand down. If you think about this from the PC era to now, then you can see how pernicious their behavior is. When you buy a laptop, the idea that you would have to go through an app store and pay a $30 tax to put a piece of software on your computer would seem insane.
30%. 30%.
Yeah, 30% tax on which would seem insane. Like if you buy a laptop, you should be able to put whatever software you want on it. But they did this magic trick where they said, oh no, if you want to put software on your phone, it has to go through the App Store. It has to be 30%. And that's really the anti-competitive thing here. I think this will be settled. And if you look at the different issues here, I think this is going to be actually a huge win for Apple, because if iMessage were to exist on Android, they would get all of those users to download iMessage and they would have all those users. If they made the watch compatible, they would open up many more people to buy the watch and you would get more watches. I think that Apple's thinking way too short term about the lock-in here, and they should allow more of these apps, allow more watches, and they should allow the gaming thing. I think that they're being petty.
I don't think anything's going to happen here because it's taken them 5 years to file. There's at least a 50% chance that the administration is going to turn over, which means that this lawsuit changes or goes away entirely. And then even if it does kind of proceed, it's going to take 10 years of very detailed arguments for something to happen. And frankly, probably in 10 years from now, we've already moved to a different compute platform and this is not going to matter.
I mean, there is the coin toss of what the Trump administration would do here. For sure, that's valid. But I think these things will get settled. I think the settlement will be iMessage releases. they allow so the thing about the Apple Watch, it's not just Saks that they're allowing it on Android. It's would you allow Android watches to connect with the SDK directly into the iOS operating system, which they block you from doing. I think they should just have a little switch in your Friedberg settings that allows you to flip it and say, I take responsibility for allowing third-party stores, and I want to be able to load any software. It's your computer.
I don't think the government should regulate that. I don't think the government should be able to mandate that.
I think I like the fact that
everyone
the government
keeps looking to the government to do things that they want as a consumer. Make your choice with your dollars. Make your vote with the product and service you want to buy instead of running to the government and asking the government to come and do stuff.
Do you feel that way about price fixing?
What do you mean price fixing? In what context?
If like a group of people price fix the cost of a phone, or like, let's say the 30% from the App Store, which just happens to be the same between two app stores. Do you think price fixing is something valid for the government to come in on?
It's not the same.
Do you think price fixing is something the government should come in on, is the question?
If there's limited access to products in a market and all the participants get together to set the price in the market, I do think that's anti-competitive, and there's a good role for the government to play there.
Okay.
But Google and Apple don't price fix because Android is an open access system. You can put any application you want, any way you want. There are several app stores to put Android apps on your Android device. Google operates an app store called Google Play, but there are other app stores you can go to as well, and they all have different prices. And Google's app store costs, by the way, are not Apple's, and they're not 30%. And we talked about this last time. I'll pull it up for you again. It's like 15 to 12 going down. It's a sliding scale. So there is competition in that market. Generally, I think the point about if there's limited access to a market for products for consumers and everyone in that market gets together and sets a price, that is anti-competitive, and there's a good role for government to play there. But I don't think that having the government come in and say, I want this feature to have this button and this flip in my app is what I want my government doing. I want my government protecting me from crime and defending the country. And I don't want all the other stuff that the government does to drive costs up, which is generally what the government does.
Sachs, what do you think the role of the government is here in terms of anti-competitiveness, especially in the case, I'm curious your thoughts on a duopoly. Like if you look at Google's search monopoly, pretty easy to understand, like, hey, they've got 90%. But here you got two players who have, roughly 50% of the market each, or 60-40, depending on where you are. So what is the proper role of government here? And is this an overreach?
No, I mean, I actually think, just to give the government lawsuit some credit, I actually think it's good to hold Apple's feet to the fire and make sure they're not engaging in anti-competitive tactics. One of the things I've said previously on the show is that I think the government's been making the mistake of going after bigness for its own sake. And I don't think that bigness in and of itself is bad. It might be a reflection that the company's done an incredibly good job, and that's why it has a lot of customers and a lot of market share. What I've said is I think the government should prevent anti-competitive tactics. So I think that this lawsuit is good in the sense that it's targeted at the right types of things. It's not just going after Apple because its market cap is so big. It's going after specific things that it's doing to kind of lock in its network effect. Now, the problem that I see is just that the examples that we've been given so far from the lawsuit just don't seem that compelling. Again, I'm kind of waiting to find out where's the smoking gun here. But to Friedberg's point, I mean, look, I don't think you can just say that if you don't like what Apple's doing, go to a different platform, because the point is that there's only two choices and they can both engage in anti-competitive tactics and they can both create lock-in.
But Sachs, there are not just two choices. Android is an open operating system. Google has a fork of Android that they put on certain smartphones. There are other smartphone makers that use other forks of Android. So Android has enabled, and the reason Google bought Android was to provide a counterbalance to exactly the dynamic of one handset manufacturer having an operating system that could control access to the internet and to apps. And so Google open sourced Android. Many handset manufacturers use their own versions of Android to put their own experience on the phone. And then Android users can put apps from anywhere they want. And other companies offer app stores. So there are many app stores to go to, and there are many different handset manufacturers. And a lot of people, I think, incorrectly look at the operating system landscape in mobile and say, oh, there's Android and there's iOS. But Android is an open platform, and there are many different forks of it run by many different companies. So I think that it is actually a very competitive market. Like we talked about last week, I think close to 80% of global handsets are run on Android forks. So, it's not necessarily the case that there are only two choices. And Google does not control Android. There are many developers that contribute to open source there. Google has their own fork that they do a lot of work on, but anyone can take their own fork and do. I mean, you guys can, when you boot up a Samsung or Sony TV, that's running Android, and that's running their own version of Android.
Are you arguing that Apple doesn't have market power?
In the US, they do. Ex-US, they're,
Yeah, I think, sure, we're talking about the US market.
I think the US market, are they about 50-50? We pulled this chart up last week, but
it's
I think they're about 50-50.
Slightly more in the US now. It might be 55-45 right now.
Yeah, something like that.
The issue is the cat and mouse that Apple is really good at playing. They will push their advantage. And so we see the 5 things that the Justice Department wants to go after here, but the App Store is obviously one of them. And before that, I mentioned some of the other categories where they do this abuse of power. They basically keep it up as much as they can until they get checked. And I think interoperability is actually in the long term going to be in their best interest. They use interoperability when they need it. So Apple Music and iTunes, they allow you to use Windows and Android. It's only when they see an advantage. And that's really the hypocrisy of Apple. And I think it's really important that the industry stand for more interoperability and the ability for you to load any software that you want on your device. This is a compute platform. The ability for them to block you from installing your own apps on it, I think, is a really terrible
precedent. By the way,
precedent.
Jason, what you're saying is a very fair statement from a consumer point of view and from an industry point of view. And that's where that voice should come from, to force in the marketplace changes from Apple. But having the government do this and having the government involved, I think sets all these bad precedents.
They're representing the people.
Somebody did it. They asked Tim Cook to do it, and Tim Cook said, pound salt, buy a phone for your mom.
No, but aren't they representing the people? Like, how do you expect the people to organize? Like, file a class action?
No, I think if enough companies boycott the Apple platform and tell consumers to boycott, consumers can make decisions.
That's not
Developers
realistic.
can make decisions whether or not they want to develop for Apple.
No, that's not realistic. You know that.
It's not realistic in the
That's
market.
naive. Come on.
I don't think I want the government stepping in to tell private companies what to do because customers don't like what they're doing.
Wait. Do you think that the government should have stepped in to prevent Microsoft from taking over the browser, the whole Netscape case?
Bundling?
I don't know the case well enough. I mean, I remember it, but I don't want to speak. I don't want to speak definitively.
I think there was a substantial chance that if the government didn't step in, that Microsoft would have extended their Windows operating system monopoly.
They did have an absolute monopoly. They did have a monopoly on personal compute OS at the time.
Well, it wasn't an absolute monopoly. I mean,
It
you
was
could
close.
still
you
could
were
use
the
Macintosh.
one. You were using Macintosh at the
No,
time.
Right,
that's
exactly.
what I'm saying. At the time, Macintosh was like 5% of the market.
It was under 10% at the time.
Yeah, it was about 4 or 5% at that time.
It was a duopoly.
Microsoft was 95% of the personal computing market, so they did have an absolute
You
monopoly
still
on
had a
that
choice.
market.
You had a consumer choice. It wasn't a very good consumer choice, but you still
What
had
was
a
my
consumer
choice?
choice. You could go use Macintosh.
And you did. You were using
I don't think
Macintosh.
a lot of people could afford it. Yeah.
Okay, but the point is that Microsoft had substantial market power, and what they were in the process of doing was the smart thing from a business standpoint, which is you take your operating system monopoly, you use that to extend into the browser, you kill Netscape, you take over with Explorer, you bake Explorer into your Windows operating system, so the two things are basically the same. Then from there, you leverage your control of the browser and the home screen to control search, okay? And so you think about like all the dominoes that would have fallen if Microsoft had continued, maybe if like Bill Gates had continued being CEO, and there would have been no Google, there would have been no Yahoo.
They would have controlled the internet.
They would have controlled the internet.
And they were actively, you left out a big piece of it, Sachs, which you'll remember the second I say it. They were trying to break HTML and open standards by creating ActiveX and using all this funky code.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you have to understand, these companies will, if you give them an inch, they'll take the mile.
Right.
And that's exactly what Apple does consistently. They consistently try to squeeze. I think it's great. Sachs is right. Tactics is the way to go after these companies. These are 5 recent tactics. I think the government's going to win changing 3 of these. And that's a win for me.
Yeah, the mobile operators tried to do the same at that same time. If you guys remember, Verizon,
yes, you couldn't have an app.
Singular, you could only put their apps, if you bought it through their store, on their operating system on the mobile phones that they contracted to have made. So they all had their own custom version of the handset manufacturer's OS, and then they did rev share back with the manufacturers. And that's why Android was acquired. It wasn't actually at the time to compete with Apple. Android was acquired to compete with all the mobile phone companies that were trying to block access to the internet and apps.
Well, Google wanted to maintain its search monopoly, let's be honest. That's,
they were also,
that's why they bought it. They knew users would be there, and they wanted to have the default
They didn't
browser.
want to have the access to the internet blocked by the handset manufacturers.
And they want it to be the default search and browser in the app, which is what you have to agree to, by the way. So if you want to talk about perniciousness and heavy-handedness, if you have an Android you want to use the Android updates from Google,
that's not correct.
You have to give the bundle of apps if you want the updates and support from Google. You can fork it, but then you don't get their support, which then breaks your phone.
If you want their version, that's right.
Yes, yeah. That's right. So they, there's a little cleverness here, I think.
So you have two basic ecosystems in mobile. It is a duopoly, and both of them advantage themselves in ways that grow over time. And I think that if Apple were completely left unchecked, it would figure out ways to boil the frog and keep extracting more and more value out of downstream applications.
Totally. They boiled the frog. We're paying $1,600 a phone now.
Yeah.
How are we paying $1,600 a phone?
So look, I think it's good for the government to hold their feet to the fire. But here's the thing that the government's lacking is, again, that example they can point to that's really compelling. I mean, with the Microsoft Netscape thing, it was really obvious what they were doing, right? The browser was the gateway to the whole new platform, which was the internet. And if Microsoft could make that a feature of the operating system, their dominance would extend into the new computing platform.
But do you remember how they did it, Sachs?
Apple Watch is just not the same thing. The Apple Watch is kind of an appendage of your phone that most people don't even want. So it's hard to point to something.
Do you remember, Sachs, how they were getting the browser built in? They were going to the OEMs, the Dells of the world, the HPs, and saying, if you want this price for Windows, you have to include the browser on the desktop. It has to load. It has to ask for your credentials, all this stuff. Or you can pay $150 for Windows if you want it without the browser bundled. So they use this pricing to get the OEMs to bundle it. And that was where...
Well, isn't that what Google's doing with Android effectively?
Exactly.
Is like...
It's exactly right.
You can have your own version without Google search if you're willing to put up with all these headaches.
And maintain an operating system, update the operating system. Yeah, it's exactly what they're doing. So anyway, I think 3 out of 5 of these get settled and it'll be good for consumers. Ultimately, I would, not financial advice, but I think that Apple's going to be able to manage this. I'd buy the stock. I may buy more of the stock. I think that this will be good for them long term.